So now we know what evolution is. Evolution is change over time. So what we need to think about now is, what is it that actually evolves? We've mentioned before that individuals cannot evolve. Instead, we're dependent on looking at populations and how populations change over time. So when we look at populations changing, what is it that would actually cause individuals of a population to not interact? When we look at those scenarios where those individuals in a population no longer interact with one another, we talk about them as becoming reproductively isolated. When this occurs, we can get speciation events. And when we get speciation events, we refer to this as macroevolution. So these are big changes over time. It also limits, in this isolation, something we refer to as gene flow. This is going to become one of our agents of microevolution, meaning it's going to be a driving force in macroevolution for us. So we'll look at this in the coming lectures. What is a population? If you had to define a population, what is it? Many folks just say, well, it's like a human population. Well, what does that mean? You can't use the word to define the word. What is a population? So we can look at it as a group of individuals of the same species. The same species part will be very, very important for us. When we start isolating and dividing individuals in these populations, what we want to look at is how those isolated or divided individuals change over time. So in our original frog population at the top here, you see the frog is kind of an intermediate color. But if we assume that over time the environment has changed, so if something happens, it's bulldozed, it's cleared out, the trees get disease, whatever. There's no longer anything in between these two forested areas. Well, you may know that frogs are very, very sensitive to moisture. They must be in moist areas. Why? They breathe through their skin. So their oxygen and CO2 exchange is actually through their skin. So when we look at frogs having to stay moist to be able to breathe, they have no interest in crossing this barren landscape between two forested areas now. So over generations, this does not happen overnight, but over generations, the populations may actually start to shift to this darker coloration to match the darker forest, and this lighter coloration to match the lighter forest. Why would they do that? Okay, so we might think about things like hiding from predators, right? But why? What is the mechanism underlying? How are they actually able to do this? We have to look at the variability in the original population. So we have to look at whether or not there are variable alleles for color in the original population. If there are, then we can select for new color traits that would make these new populations better fit. What was fitness? We have to look for changes in these populations. Changes may already exist in populations. We may have multiple alleles for color or for size of thumb or whatever you want to look at. But we can also look at the idea that mutations, many random, mutations are random to DNA. Those random mutations may actually form new alleles for us. We can think about this later as far as the logistics, but what I want you to keep in mind is if we are looking at a population of any organisms, that population has a particular set of alleles. So in the human population, we have alleles for brown hair, black hair, and blonde hair, right? So that's the allele set that we have. It's also referred to as something known as the gene pool. The gene pool includes all alleles in a population. Can you imagine counting every single allele in the human population? It would be huge, right? But this is what we are dependent on. These alleles, and in particular, the variability in the alleles. So keep that in mind as we talk about things. These alleles, remember, are just pieces of chromosomes. So here we give you 3 different gametes, 3 different alleles. They're color-coded for you. A just stands for allele, okay? So what we want to think about is if we have 2 parents and they're producing gametes, right? So eggs or sperm. What they contribute to those gametes is what's passed on to the next generation. So from our parents here, the first parent can only contribute red alleles. Why? Well, they only have red alleles, right? You can only give what you have. So in our second parent, though, we have 2 different alleles. We have a yellow allele and a green allele. So those alleles can actually split out and form high levels of variability in the new offspring. You notice these 2 offspring that arise from 2 fertilization events are different from both parents. Why is that? Well, we've talked before. Meiosis creates gametes. Meiosis separates alleles, and then random fertilization with an egg and sperm bring those alleles back together, sometimes in very new combinations. This is amazing. This adds variability to evolution. Without variability, there is no evolution. So we have to have this variability in the gametes to actually have and see evolution in the future. What we're going to look at is this shuffling. So just like you were shuffling a deck of cards, we're going to look at the shuffling of alleles in a population. So to get our frogs back into the mix here, we can look at the alleles of the original populations. What alleles were present that formed the skin color we talked about? Well, when we look at the copies of the chromosomes in this case, you see that there's 2 different alleles here, 2 different alleles here, and when we look at where they originally came from, we can see that they do share an allele in common, this A2, one from mom, one from dad in these new generations. But what we want to think about is it's the recombination, this new assortment of alleles in the new offspring that lead to the differing color patterns. Remember, our original was some sort of intermediate green, right? But they carried the information for both of these color patterns. That's critical for evolution to actually occur. So the idea that you're taking a sperm that's haploid and an egg that's haploid and you're putting it together to form a diploid zygote is critical to look at genetic variation. This shuffling of alleles will be very, very important for us when we consider microevolution, which is simply a change in allele frequency in a population, versus macroevolution, where we actually look at the formation of new species.